Hi guys, welcome to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host as always, Steve Hall, and I am welcomed again by Brad Schoenfeld, who hasn't been on the show for a while, but had a fantastic episode that was incredibly well received many months ago. And today we are going to be talking to Brad's favorite subject, hypertrophy. He is the muscle hypertrophy expert, has done tons of research in the area, has fantastic books, and I can't thank him enough, and you guys I'm sure can't either. And I really want to delve into something that Brad recently released over social media. Everyone knows these infographics we're seeing that try and simplify points, and Brad did his own great job at this and has been, and these were quite well received, and we just wanted to delve into these a little bit further. A quote I wanted to bring up initially that Brad made was that the majority of maximizing muscle growth, perhaps as much as 70%, is obtained from simply training hard and eating right. The other 30% is what separates good physiques from great ones. And this is what most of the listeners are probably looking for, that 30%, because a lot of people won't be listening in who are just interested in getting a great physique. They kind of want even better. So that's what we want to delve into, if you're happy to do that, Brad.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you basically summarized what I said very nicely in that if you just get to the gym and you are consistent, you lift weights, even people that use roughly poor form, what I would consider poor form, and have very little concept of program design. They're either doing the same thing like every time and not necessarily exercises that might maximize the growth in all the muscles, but more single joint stuff, whatever. You can make substantial gains. And of course, eating right. When I say eating right, that's primarily protein intake, taking in sufficient protein to support growth. The other two, protein and calories. If you're going to be very low in calories, it's also going to be very difficult. So that would be really the two primary factors. The carbohydrate and fat intake would be much less of any consequence. And yeah, you can get substantial gains. And I would say putting it in a percentage, which is always somewhat difficult, but yeah, 70-75% of gains probably are just showing up on a regular basis and getting in sufficient protein and calories.
And obviously there's so much that goes into those two aspects that the listeners will realize, and many people should realize, like the whole, recoveries within there, and then there's nutritional timing within there that could have a role, and all these various aspects. What I do want to ask is, when we are talking about training hard, do you have kind of a definition of what that might look like? Is that relative intensity for you?
So that would be intensity of effort. That means that if you're lifting, like doing the Tracy Anderson workout where you're lifting 2-pound dumbbells, that's not going to cut it. So you need to be not necessarily going to failure, but you need to be lifting. You need to be challenging your muscles. You need to be lifting close to failure. To use the scale that my colleague Eric Helms devised. By the way, my doggies are kind of going crazy in the background, so if you hear stuff.
They're enjoying the chat.
My two babies. But Eric Helms had repetitions in reserve, basically how many reps before failure. And to me, that would be probably somewhere this would also depend somewhat on what rep range you're training in. So if you're training in a rep range of 3 and you're only doing a single, it might not be enough. But anyway, with your moderate rep range is the so-called hypertrophy rep range, 6 to 12 reps or so. If you're at a rep RIR of 2 to maybe even 3, that would be sufficient.
Mm-hmm. So would you say 3 reps in reserve would be where your cap is in terms of people going kind of hard enough when you're in that kind of hypertrophy rep range?
I hesitate to have hard caps. So I think that if you're always training with an RIR of 3, you're probably also not going to max. You'd be somewhat short. But you want to approximate failure. I'd say at least some of those sets should be towards the 1. There's no right answer there. And when I start giving hard cutoffs, people take it that literally, and there really is no way to really quantify that. Mm-hmm. So I would just say somewhere you're training within an RIR of 0 to 3, and how that comes out. But basically, you need to be what it comes down to is challenging your muscles beyond their present capacity. And then there's going to be nuances within that. But again, just to clarify this too, that is only getting you. So that's a majority of the mass that you can acquire. But if you're certainly if you want more than that, if you're your average stockbroker or insurance saleswoman and you just want some nice muscle, et cetera, yeah, you don't need to, doing the nuances are not going to have really meaningful effects, substantially meaningful effects. If you're a dude or a gal that wants to maximize their muscle mass, the nuances are going to be huge. So what you were talking about before, the manipulation of program variables, the somewhat nutrient timing to some extent, how the protein, let's say, is spread out throughout the day, in particular recovery. I know when I put that out, a lot of people got all bent out of shape in recovery. Yeah, I mean, if you're going to have zero sleep, I mean, again, people start reducing this to ridiculous absurdisms. So people would say, well, if you get no sleep, well, of course, it's if you're getting the difference here again, that would be like if you're getting no nutrients whatsoever, if you just are starving, or no training whatsoever. So again, it gets to be, hopefully when these infographics go out, people should take them with the concept that you're getting some sleep. And to what I have seen through the literature and through personal experience, if you're getting even people that are fairly sleep deprived, they're getting 4 or 5 hours a day, still can get a lot of their gains. Now they again they won't be maximizing their gains. So yeah, I would say that generally more getting your 7-8 hours a day is more ideal if you're looking for maximal gains. But you're not going to get no gains if you're sleeping 5 hours a day and you're doing if you're training hard and getting good nutrition, you will get 75% of your gains even with somewhat of a sleep deprived state. And I can say that with a high degree of confidence.
No, perfect. And I think it would be interesting for me to ask you, actually, I know kind of our audience are mostly natural trainees, but often we look towards, for hypertrophy, the biggest guys who are obviously normally on performance enhancing drugs that can dramatically change their ability to recover from things. When we're thinking about failure training, we often see those big guys kind of go into failure quite often. Do you think maybe for the listeners, do you think that's probably not the right way for them to go? Do you think probably leaving some reps in reserve the majority of the time is probably more beneficial for them?
So the concept of training to failure is, I actually just did an article I have a column on bodybuilding.com and just did an article about that. And it's somewhat of a murky topic. We'd like to think that all these things have been really well studied. They haven't. Certainly, this is a topic that has been poorly studied. And then it starts coming down. So what are you comparing? Are you comparing training to failure versus an RIR of 1 versus an IR of 2? What rep range are you comparing that in? We just had a paper that's currently in review that looks at the topic with different rep ranges, and the rep range is going to have certain effects on that. And we used untrained subjects in that study, so it only can tell you so much. What I would extrapolate just from where anecdote comes in. So what I always say is that an evidence-based approach, you look to the literature, but the literature is never going to tell you what to do. It's never going to completely answer your questions. It's going to provide guidelines, and especially on a topic like this, like training to failure, where there's so many nuances involved. I do think that some training to failure can be potentially beneficial. How much of a difference is that going to make? My take would be that if you're a competitive bodybuilder like yourself, or someone that just wants to get maximally jacked, that might eke out a little extra gains. But I think also that if for 98% of gains, or the vast majority of gains, that probably certainly 95, I would say with a high degree of confidence, 95 plus percentage of gains, that if you get an RIR of 1 where you leave 1 in the tank, that you will get just as much as you will if you're training in that vein in the side of your temple is writhing like a snake.
No, amazing. And I think that's a good takeaway for people, because when we are talking about these things, it's like a sliding scale. It's not like a bit doesn't provide anything, and then the more doesn't just provide incrementally more and more benefit. So I think that's important for the listeners to take away. If they aren't someone who, I mean, it's kind of a bit of a stress relief for a lot of people who are listening, like, oh, I don't have to go to places that are potentially even could create injury, or go to places that are just really uncomfortable for a certain person. And we've seen this with volume, I guess, as well.
I should also add that that does not mean that even failure, it's context dependent in terms of how often, not only within the training session itself, but over the course of the training cycle, if you will. And my take on that would be that it really needs to be selective. Doing training to failure on every set, if anything, could hamper gains. So like the last set would be a target to really take your muscles to failure. That was the strategy that Dorian Yates used effectively. And I would also say that training with single joint exercises, it's more relevant to use the training to failure on single joint exercises, whereas, let's say, squats, not only is there a higher percentage of a higher risk of injury, higher percentage risk of injury, but also it's exceedingly demanding on the body to do a squat to failure. It just takes a lot out of you, and that can affect the volume that you end up doing in the rest of the workout. So trying to save your failure to your single joint moves, perhaps your machine-based moves, even with multi-joint, looking at it more from a machine standpoint, at least from an injury standpoint, that would reduce that risk. So those are, again, other considerations. Most of these topics are highly nuanced, and giving a cookie cutter answer would not be doing justice to the topic.
Mm-hmm. No, I completely agree. And I think it's something I think for most of the listeners who are well educated and they've listened to the podcast before, they've seen lots of your work already, they should probably have a fairly logical reasoning you can come out with which exercises make sense that could be failure, could be safe, and which exercises to definitely avoid it on, and kind of thinking about technical failure and all of those aspects. So no, I think that's incredibly important ways to say how nuanced it is, context dependent. And on the same sort of ilk of talking about like pushing things to the limit, something that a few people have talked about is this kind of overreaching and this super compensation. And obviously we've seen this throughout some other areas within sports, but not so much muscle growth and bodybuilding. Is this something that you are thinking is favorable for bodybuilders, especially those seeking maximal muscle growth, or do you think it's not something that we should go towards?
No, I absolutely do. I've written about that. I've actually, in my books, discussed this. And I've used that concept not only in my own training, but also when I've worked with a lot of high-level bodybuilders, physique athletes, and I've had very good success with it. Generally, my approach is to use increased frequency to increase volume over time. So basically look to a supercompensation phase. Volume is a primary driver of hypertrophy. It's been well documented. And what I look to do generally is to push more volume by increasing the frequency over a period of time. So I might go from a 3-day-a-week training approach to a 4-day-a-week, let's say 3-day-a-week total body, 4-day-a-week upper-lower split, to a 6-day-a-week multi-level split. And that would be more where you're looking to peak for a given point, and then you go back and you go through the cycle again. And what you look to do is to have a super compensatory response in that final phase. I kind of liken it to approaching a cliff, where you're going towards the edge of that cliff without going over. If you just keep training high volume, you're going to end up going over that cliff. Mm-hmm. And that's the overtraining. If you want to use the analogy, overtraining is over the cliff. Or not, some people call it non-functional overreaching, because with resistance training, the overtraining actually was a endurance-based concept that's been applied to resistance training, and how that manifests, there can be different. Still not clear in terms of the types of symptoms you experience, but regardless of what it is, you're going to have performance decrements and hamper your not only recovery but also your accretion of lean mass. So my concept is to have these cycles of training blocks that push towards a supercompensatory response, and then repeat the cycle. And they're also staggered with deloads, so that even within these blocks, you don't overtrain as well.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah, exactly. I can remember it quite well in the Max Muscle Plan, kind of the blocks you're describing with the deloads, and then increasing frequency throughout until a point where obviously you then repeat drawback volume and you incrementally accumulate and build it up again. And I found success with that myself and with my clients, and it will be great to see it kind of come more out within the research. I guess it's a longer term studies that you kind of require, and the population is quite difficult to get hold of.
That's exactly it. So the problem, so as much as I'd love to study this, the time commitment, the time frame to actually see this in practice where you're not, because the idea is to not see an overtrained response. And where is that going to come? You're going to need a longer period of time. So if someone trained, certainly I would say 16 weeks straight, we're training a lot of failure training with higher volumes, then you're going to start to see this. But it's hard to get in a college environment, a 16-week study. So then if you can do an 8-week study, it's probably not enough. We've done tons of them. Generally, we don't start seeing those overtraining symptoms manifest in that period of time. Or if we do, they're not apparent. We'd have to have a midpoint testing, and it's hard to fathom or hard to assess whether that's actually occurring in that.
Mm-hmm. No, then I guess this is exactly where kind of the anecdote and your experience has to come with the science, laying the foundation there first. To talk more to...
we can do a GoFundMe page and maybe get enough money. We can make that happen. So.
I think maybe we get all the kind of the bodybuilding podcasts and all the kind of blogs out there and just all channel it one way. I actually think it probably would go pretty far.
You get a couple of thousand people chipping in $10 and we have a study.
I mean, yeah, we should talk about that in future, actually. I actually think that could be really good. So actually, to talk to our next point of the kind of the good nutrition, talking about calories and getting sufficient protein, when I think a lot of people are interested in that kind of surplus of calories and what size of a surplus, and the kind of research in that area, again, there's not much there. There's kind of a couple of studies that have looked at surpluses, but it's not very specific to bodybuilders. What is your thoughts and what have you seen to kind of work the best in that regard in terms of like size of surplus, length of time, actually gaining weight, and maybe even like body fat, how far to push it?
So the first thing that you have to realize when we talk about a surplus, it's always an estimate. I mean, there's no way we're going to know exactly what someone's caloric needs are. You're always just estimating. And even then, it's going to change. So what you're estimating at one point over the course of, let's say you're dieting, there's going to be huge changes downward just because of adaptive thermogenesis. And when you're going upwards, same thing, there will be other adaptations where your metabolism actually will speed up some. So your body, it's the leptin model. But within that, but we can get close with that. And my general rule is to look to, within those estimates, look for about a 300 to 500 calorie per day surplus. It's somewhat dependent on the person, usually hard gainers I have with a higher surplus. And those who are more mesomorphic and able to put on mass, we can do more of what they might call clean bulk. Some people refer to it as a clean bulk, which is 300 or so. But somewhere in that range, and sometimes I've gone even a little over. Again, these are the things that we can give guidelines, and that's through research, even through experience. But everyone is different, and I've had people need to go up to 700 plus calories, at least from an estimated standpoint, real hard gainers that just weren't putting on sufficient muscle. And at some point, you're going to put on muscle. You're going to put on some fat too. But those are the things that we can give guidelines, but you can only tweak based on the experience and based upon progress.
Mm-hmm. And with that, are you looking for a certain rate of weight gain, or do you kind of base it upon many factors, sort of like performance, how visually they look? Obviously you do, but do you have a general idea of how much you're looking for them to gain or anything along those lines?
Well, we can talk about ideals. Ideally, I'd like someone to gain, so you're talking about a trained subject, trained person, and then you have to differentiate between if it's a highly trained bodybuilder who's a natty, mm-hmm. That's going to be different as well. But let's say your average trained guy who's going into the gym, he's built up a good amount of muscle, been training for a few years. Generally, I'm looking to put on about a pound of muscle a month. Can be a little more, but a good rate of gain is about a quarter pound per week. If we can get it up to 2 pounds per month, that's very good. And certainly that's doable with some people. But on average, we're generally looking at a pound, maybe a little more, pound and a half per month in a trained subject. For someone who is very well-trained bodybuilder who's natty, we might be looking at a couple of pounds over a 3-month period would be a very good result.
And is that a pound of muscle? So you not including the fat that might come along with that, or is that actual?
Yeah, no. We're not talking about body weight. We're talking about muscle.
Yeah.
And then there's intracellular muscle water that can become away. So again, it depends on your mode of measurement. Generally, I have very sophisticated measures at my lab, my research lab, but when we're looking in the field, you're generally doing body comp measures like Schoenfeld, where you're doing a crude estimate just of lean mass versus fat mass, and you're assuming that your lean mass is muscle, which is not necessarily, because there can be water weight associated with it. So these are some of the tribulations that when you're looking to try to gauge progress, but the astute professional will take those things into account, and then your eye is going to tell you as well to some extent. That can be blurred somewhat by you. So my goal generally, you're going to gain a little bit of body fat when you're in a surplus. The idea is to somewhat minimize. You don't want to. You can do a dirty bulk. You do like the Lee Priest bulk, where you're 5'4" and 300 pounds, and then you shred down. But especially if you're natty, you're going to end up losing a ton of money. It's just not worth it's very taxing on your body, first of all, to carry that much weight and fat, not healthy. And you generally will end up losing more. I found that it's to have a smaller muscle gain, but also smaller fat mass, your net is better overall in that respect than if you just gained a ton of weight and you also gained more muscle, then you had to lose all that fat to trim down.
No, I think it's important for the listeners to realize that I think a lot of them try and gain at the the ideal rate limiting muscle growth gain. So that pound a month for like that intermediate. And I think sometimes they end up holding themselves back a little bit, not providing that kind of the 500 calorie surplus, which could equate to about a pound a week on the scale. So I think that's important to kind of tell them.
Yeah, and I think it's right. It's also important that you want to go the other way and say, well, obviously everyone wants to get shredded and get jacked at the same time. And I will tell you that research from my lab clearly shows, I see it all the time, where you can have recomposition of your body. But it's not like the amount of muscle that you gain is substantially less than you do if you have a surplus. And it depends on the person and their training level. Like the more well-trained you are and also the less fat you have to lose, the harder that is, the harder and harder. So if you're already, let's say you're 10% body fat now, and you've been training hard for 3 or 4 years, whatever it is, your ability to put on muscle will be very small. If you can, while you're cutting, your ability to put on muscle while you're cutting. So and then you need to cut very slowly. So it starts to be a self-defeating proposition to try to do that. You're better off trying to just adding a little body fat, not a ton, but some body fat. You'll gain a little fat, gain muscle, and then you work on maintaining the muscle while you're cutting.
Mm-hmm. No, I think especially for more advanced trainees, that kind of specificity of nutritional input is so important. People all the time end up I think that's what holds a lot of intermediate kind of trainees back. They just don't realize the importance of nutrition and getting that right. So no, I think that's excellent. And in terms of where you like to keep, say, a competitive bodybuilder's body fat, do you have a range for a male that you'd like to keep them within, like so you don't push too far? Because I don't know if you have experience with maybe pushing a bit higher, maybe performance and the ability to use more load increases. What are your thoughts there, Brad?
Yeah, generally I don't like a bodybuilder to be over around 20% body fat. And then that would depend upon when their show is. That's when their show is way out. To me, you don't want to have to be losing fat at a fast clip, because that's when you start to see muscle loss associated with it. So you'd have to specify at what point in the training. I like to have a bodybuilder within a few pounds, 3 or 4 pounds within roughly 6 weeks out. They should be within 3-4 pounds of their goal weight. And when I say weight, that would include muscle and fat. So you're going to be just shredding at that point, and there's going to be some water loss, but while maintaining muscle. So do the math. You're not going to be able to really bulk a lot. Now, if you're telling me you're not doing a show for 2 years, yeah, then you can even go a little bit higher. But that's not the case with most bodybuilders. If you're talking about a bodybuilder, usually they're competing within the year, at least once, not multiple times. And that's where then it would depend upon how close they are to their show, how many times they're competing. I wouldn't let them be at 20% if they have a show, and if they're doing 4 shows a year, let's say you spread out and they're 4 or 5 months away, then you want to be more towards that 12, 13, 14%. Assuming your target, to me, if you're in peak condition, a bodybuilder should be 6% body fat, at least by the methods that we have. How accurately that actually is from dissection, we don't know. But the methods that we have of assessment would say roughly 5 to 6%. That ideal would be in that realm. So, cutting fat should be a fairly slow process if you're looking to maintain muscle in a high-level bodybuilder.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I guess that it might be the more novice trainees or the kind of junior team competitors who maybe competed early, then they can push their body weight up a bit more, and they kind of need to because they want to come to stage again heavier next time. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I would, if it's someone like that, then you'd probably recommend, hey, don't do a show for a year or whatever, and spend some time just putting on some mass. Those are all the things those are the nuances that we talked about that I can't give a cookie cutter for, because that's where you're individual. I can give you general guidelines as far as that goes, but everyone, the essence of prescription is individualization.
Yes.
And there will be fairly large differences in how your approach is going to be based upon where someone's at, and many, many nuances.
Yeah, no, definitely. And then in terms of keeping someone a bit leaner, do you ever implement things like the mini cuts? I don't know if you've heard of that term, like shorter fat loss periods. Do you utilize those in your own kind of like programming for those bodybuilders?
I don't. I know my good buddy Mike Israetel has talked about those a lot. I haven't personally, but it's not that I'm against doing it. It's just not something I've implemented. Mm-hmm. It's an interesting concept. Whether it is more beneficial or not, I can't say because I've not used it.
Okay, perfect. No, that's fine. We've covered kind of the hard training aspect. We've kind of covered the proper nutritional aspect. We've covered the surplus and protein, which I think a lot of the listeners are aware of. When we're talking about everything else, is there anything within that you think a lot of people who are seeking hypertrophy just get wrong a lot of the time, and they maybe place too much emphasis on other things that don't matter as much?
Yeah, I mean, things like slamming a protein shake the second they're out of the gym. Like, people do get caught up a lot in the bro science. Now, when we talk about bro science, I know a lot of bros get offended by that term. I'm a bro. I started out my career devouring Joe Weider magazines, Muscle and Fitness, Flex, and things like Muscle Development and Ironman, all the rags back in the 90s. So it's not a derogatory term in that respect, but it's what I'm getting at here is they're listening to the micromanaging that a bodybuilder will do. And look, for a bodybuilder, slamming a shake is probably a good idea. As much as I've done all this talk about nutrient timing, I can't say that you might not be able to eke out a little more gains. But again, that's window dressing. That's the icing on the cake. And what you're talking about, the people that you're referring to are forgetting about the cake. They're forgetting about, when you look at the frosting, that's really the end aspect of it that you worry about when you're at the level of a high level competitor, bodybuilder or physique athlete. So things like fasted cardio for fat loss, these are all like kind of buzz terms that get latched onto, and people forget about the hardcore stuff like good program design. So that's where you're looking to get that 25-30%, the proper manipulation of program variables, doing things like pushing the body over time towards a supercompensatory response, getting the proper exercise rotations in so that you're working the muscles from proper angles. Mm-hmm. The guys that just say squat, deadlift, and bench press, well, if you're a power lifter, that's great. If you want to that's one of the big things that separates bodybuilders from power lifters. If you look at their physiques, they're not symmetrically developed, the power lifter, unless they're adding in, unless the ones that are some actually that do add in that they're power builders, if you will. But that's where we're adding in the supplementary exercise, focusing on the development of the different heads of the muscles. And even within certain muscles, there's actually some good evidence that muscles are innervated in a compartmental basis, so that within the muscle itself, you can activate certain aspects individually. So these are all, I think, things that should be focused on to a much greater extent than that icing that I talked about.
Mm-hmm. No, yeah, definitely. And I think it's really interesting to hear you talk about the importance of having different variants of maybe exercises, angles, that sort of thing. And we actually recently had a roundtable on the podcast with Mena Henselman, Mike Israel, and Eric Helms talking about kind of exercise variation, where that lies. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on kind of how you vary things, how often you do, and whether you kind of have any core movements that you never change. What's your approach to that generally for like a bodybuilder who maybe doesn't need to always squat, bench, deadlift because there are no exercises they have to do to grow their physique?
Yeah, so it's somewhat, I don't have a set program in that respect that is the exact same thing for everyone, but the general guidelines that I use, that I do like to have movements that are more complex, I like to keep in more frequently. So I like to have a fairly set rotation, like a squat. I'm not going to have someone do a squat once a month because it's inefficient. Their squatting technique is going to end up suffering because that's a move that requires a lot of repetitive use to maintain a good form and a good connection in terms of your recruitment patterns and your coordination. Whereas I will vary more frequently, like single joint movements, machine type movements, a lot, even like a leg press can be varied more frequently. How often that's done? I mean, I don't go crazy with rotating exercises. Again, I like to have a certain stability within a routine over the course of a month or so. But within that month, certainly on a week-to-week basis, I'll vary some of the single joint moves. I might do like a cable fly, and some of them will be kind of nuances. So you might do a cable fly one week for the chest, and a dumbbell fly the next week for the chest. So you're keeping in. I look at hitting the muscles from all the various angles and using various techniques. I have a whole, way beyond what we can cover here, but I have a whole seminar that I do on exercise selection. Mm-hmm. So if you look at, let's say, given muscles, let's say the chest muscle, well, you can target the upper and lower aspects of the chest through incline, flat, and even through decline, to even getting the sternal head of the pectoral, certain other fibers in. Then you can also look at single joint exercises for the pecs, so you're looking at your fly movements. And then you can look at different modalities of training, such as cables versus barbells versus dumbbells. So I like to try to, and they will all change the recruitment patterns. So with that said, I will, again, try to keep certain, like a dumbbell exercise for the chest, if that's going to be in that person's rotation. Part of that then will depend on preference. Yep. So do I give a barbell bench press to everyone? No. Personally, I haven't done barbell bench press in 5 years. It just doesn't sit well in my shoulders. I feel my shoulders get sore from that exercise. So I like the dumbbell chest press. If that's going to be that's a very complex move that it requires even more coordination than a barbell bench press. I'm going to keep that in the rotation a lot more frequently. Whereas a fly can be rotated more, and especially if you're looking at a pec deck, I can have that in once a month as a rotation exercise, and I can do a pec deck once a year and not have any decrement to my performance. Mm-hmm. So really that's kind of the essence of it, and then it does get individualized. In my books, that's one of the things that I try to impart, that I can only give what I look to do is to give a training template. And within that, so I give all sorts of suggestions for exercises. How they actually put it together needs to come down to preference, and then a bunch of the other things that I talked about.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes really good sense, because, I mean, some exercises are inherently more complex and you only really get good at them after a number of weeks. So if you're then going to pull it out once you've just got good, it doesn't really make sense. Whereas a machine, for the most part, you just kind of sit in it and you can do it. And I guess this is why more advanced trainees, maybe you see them switching things more frequently, because I guess they have that skill component down. They kind of know how to do the squat. So if they did not do it for a period of time, they can come back to it and still perform quite well.
Exactly. The bodybuilder, I'll generally look to have somewhat more variation in their routine. Now, but again, with a squat, if they're going to have a squat, and a squat there's no exercise, contrary to what some people propose. I don't believe there's any exercise that has to be in anyone's routine. So the thought that you have to squat is silly. Mm-hmm. You need to do, obviously, leg exercises that work the hip muscles, quads, but certainly there's nothing that says a squat. There's plenty of bodybuilders, pro bodybuilders that have built very good legs that don't squat. But if you're going to have a squat in a rotation, even a very high level bodybuilder, I would not advise them to do that once a month. If they want to do it once a month, I'd say just take the squat out, because it's higher risk of injury potential and a low return factor, because you're still going to lose some neural components of that. Their squat will look better than a intermediate and certainly a novice over time, but generally speaking, they will, especially if they're pushing the weights a little. It's not going to be pretty if they haven't squatted in a long time.
And on that note, actually, of kind of pushing heavy loads, with the deadlift, this is kind of like, it's always, even for powerlifters, like the joker in the deck of the 3 lifts, because it's just so fatiguing. For a bodybuilder, do you use deadlifts off the floor extensively, like a conventional sumo, or do you more so go towards other hip hinge movements to kind of develop the posterior chain and maybe the back?
I generally do not put deadlift. So depending upon how I'm structuring a program, I will, if I have a strength cycle, which often I do, depends on the bodybuilder, but I will put deads within a strength cycle. Yeah. And then the routine is structured more specifically for pushing a lot of weight and developing max strength. You're going to get some hypertrophy potentially. Usually the volume's lower, so that's not really the focus there. In a bodybuilding routine, a bodybuilding cycle, I generally do not use deadlifts. They're extremely, like you said, demanding, number one. They also have a higher risk for potential for injury, especially as bodybuilders are going to start usually within that phase to diet more and getting down. So I generally look to, it also involves so many muscle groups, so trying to structure it in a routine, it can impair recovery depending upon where it's put in. So I'll use more like a stiff-legged deadlift, a pull-throughs, good mornings as a more single joint hip hinge movement.
No, yeah, perfect. And I mean, out of personal experience, when I was weaker, I could get away with it for the hypertrophy work. But as I've got stronger, it kind of just impedes everything else by quite a degree. So removing it has just allowed, me to feel much more fresh for things like bent over rows, for example, which before were just almost a no-no because of all the kind of deadlifting. So no, that's very interesting. And I know there's one particular exercise that you're not fond of for bodybuilders, and I want to see if there's anything else that you maybe think bodybuilders maybe not wanting to do too much, and that's the kind of front raise, obviously hitting the anterior deltoid, mostly because we just get lots of anterior delt work within our program generally when we're pressing. Is there anything else that is kind of in that kind of group of exercises where you're like, we probably get enough work there from other things, we don't need to put our efforts towards that, and we could spend our kind of recovery and performance capacity better in other ways?
So the front raise, there's no exercise that I say someone should do. I just don't think, I think that 98% of bodybuilders are not only are they not underdeveloped in their front delts where they need that, they're generally overdeveloped there because of all the other work they do. So it's generally not, I almost never program, unless it be a specific injury that someone's recovering from that would require that. It's just a poor return exercise. It doesn't delve into your recovery that much because it's a single joint move, but it's just a wasted movement, and it can end up, you can end up overdeveloping. It can cause even more overdevelopment of that muscle, whereas you should be spending that time looking to balance out the delts and working more on your middle and posterior heads. That's the primary one that I think of. It's not off the top of my head. There's ones that I just don't generally like. I think they're poor risk reward exercises, like a behind the neck pull down. I generally don't do, because actually the activation is greater in the pull down to the front, and there can be potentially impingement issues by the back pull down. I just don't think it really adds anything. So it's something I don't personally program. I do abide by the general rule that there's generally no such thing as a bad exercise, only poor performance of that exercise or poor use for a given person. So everything generally is on the table depending on the person, but there's some that I'm much less inclined to use.
I know for me personally, like overhead pressing is something I've kind of was always including, and I kind of turned my head to it and focused more on kind of incline pressing and just flat barbell pressing, and used a lot more kind of isolation movements for the side delts. Is that ever something you use in your own?
I do use the military press personally and with clients that I work with, but is it required? No. I'm working now with a very high-level bodybuilder who's going to be competing in a pro qualifier, and he's not doing he's got certain shoulder issues, and it precludes doing overhead presses, and we're just focusing on single joint moves. So everything is on or off the table depending upon who the person is and what their individual needs are and abilities.
Yeah, no, exactly. And that's why I love these chats with you, Brad, because I mean, you bring up individualization all the time, which I think is just something people have to remember whenever they're listening to these. And whenever you give out recommendations, you always give that caveat. So I really enjoy that. And something I did want to ask you actually was talking about kind of the programming variables. We know progressive overload, kind of making things harder over time is quite important. Is there any specific kind of schemes that you personally really like? If people are aware of like double or triple progression, or even if you've ever utilized something that Mike has obviously made a little bit more popular with adding sets, is that ever something you've considered utilizing within your own programming, Brad?
Well, I actually mentioned it before. So first of all, progressive overload, the term load is in there, so a lot of people just assume that it means adding on weight. That is not necessarily the case. So progressive overload, you increase volume, you are progressively overloading, and that is a primary strategy that I use. So I generally don't like to have sessions unless you're doing the cell phone workout where you're chatting for 10 minutes on the phone, doing another set. I mean, that's really not the time that you're spending isn't really relevant there. But for people that are coming into the gym, they're doing your rest intervals of 2 minutes or so, 90 seconds, 2 minutes, and they're training through and they're training hard. Anything over about an hour and 15, hour and a half really starts, what you're going to get past that, you really start to compromise what you're getting. So I don't like to add more volume within sessions. So I said I like to add frequency, which is a form of overload, and thus more volume. So you then restructure your routine around that. So that is a primary overload concept that I like to use. I also like to push failure a little, especially within an overreaching block where you start doing more failure towards the end of, let's say that way you're doing a 1 month, 6 day a week block. Maybe that last week, every set will be carried out, or almost every set. Certainly all the single joint exercises. These are things that I varied, again, depending upon the skill of the individual. So a very high level bodybuilder, they're going to be very close to their genetic ceiling, and that's where you're going to try pushing them more, and recovery is generally going to be better. Whereas if it's more intermediate, even low-level advanced, those are going to be mitigated. So these are all strategies that I use as far as pushing progressively overloading weight. Certainly I do look to keep, I think, trying to increase weight within a given rep range is an important factor. And that's why I like to have a strength cycle generally within a hypertrophy goal, when the programming is hypertrophy, having some type of strength cycle, which will then allow you to use heavier loads in your hypertrophy routine. Mm-hmm. But how that plays out is just very variable.
Mm-hmm. No, perfect. And I'm glad you brought up the load element, because I think a lot of people do end up chasing the load. And whilst I guess that's very important for strength sports, for powerlifting, for a bodybuilder, you've shown various times that there's many ways to progress, and load certainly isn't the only one you can play with.
Yeah. And by the way, so this is where, going back to your first question about getting 70, 75% of your results, that's where the new one,
Yeah.
we're discussing all the things that are really important to get you to that next level and really to reach your ultimate potential, or at least to approach it. Whereas for the average Jane or Joe, who's a stockbroker, insurance saleswoman, whatever it is, these things are, so you can use a very simple routine to get that 70-75%. People will kind of, there's some researchers even that kind of poo-poo, well, you don't need these complex routines. You do need to get a lot more complex to maximize your potential. And anyone that doesn't believe that, I think, has never really trained high-level athletes and high-level bodybuilders, et cetera. So unfortunately, there are a lot of researchers who go right from they go from their college to their master's to their PhD, and they've never entrenched themselves in the field. They're very good researchers, per se. They carry out studies well, but their understanding of the human body, they're doing studies in untrained subjects, trying to extrapolate some of these findings to high-level bodybuilders. It just doesn't, the generalization is not there.
Mm-hmm. And if you've got time, I have one more question, if I can throw that at you. That is to do with kind of your thoughts on the hypertrophy pathways. Obviously, you released your paper many years ago with the 3 hypertrophic pathways. And there's been some thoughts that maybe it's just mechanical tension that's driving everything. And so...
I'm getting my dog up here because he keeps nipping at my heels.
Oh, no. He wants to get involved.
So you keep going with the mechanical tension, right?
So yeah, it was basically, there's some thought that maybe it's just mechanical tension, that the other hypertrophy pathways that you kind of theorized aren't actually important. What are your thoughts on that? Are you still for kind of metabolic damage and metabolic stress even?
Metabolic stress, muscle damage. So people can have, there's certain people, anyone that's saying that it's just mechanical tension, they're entitled to their opinion, but that's an opinion. And it can be a knowledgeable opinion per se, but there's certainly good evidence, as I've proposed and I've written review papers on. We actually have collaborated with some really high-level exercise scientists and physiologists. It's kind of, I would say, somewhat of an update to my paper, to my 2010 paper that looks at we're basically looking at the 3 proposed factors, mechanical tension, metabolic stress, and muscle damage. And we go through what the cases are for each one and what the limitations are. And certainly there's a lot of limitations in trying to extrapolate research, because let's say muscle damage, when you try to isolate muscle damage, there's going to be confounding factors that other factors will come in. My dog is snoring now. And so bottom line is that no one knows this, but I think there is a strong rationale, or certainly a good rationale, to say that it's not just mechanical tension. But when we look at the sensors, how forces are mechanochemically induced to ultimately carry out protein synthesis. There's many confounding issues that I think it's going to be a long time before we're able to really isolate these things and have a conclusive understanding of them. But I do think at this point there is enough good evidence to say that it is more than just the forces acting, and that there are other factors that come into play.
Amazing. And thank you so much for taking the time, Brad. Really appreciate it. That's everything I have for you right now. And I just want to, if you've got anything coming out that you want to let the listeners know about, whether you've got any kind of seminars coming up or any kind of new books or research that might be of interest to people.
I have seminars virtually every month. I mean,
Amazing.
I'm in, where am I? I'm in Chile next week. I'm in, by the time this comes out, I'm probably already done my Chile seminar, but then I'm in Slovenia at the end of this month, at the end of June. I have a ton of them. They can just follow me on social media. I always list those things. I have my books that are available. Do a lot of social media work, free stuff. I try to put out, I'm an educator, so I try to put out free content and educate. That's my job. And anyone who is looking, We just got approval for a master's program at Lehman College in the Bronx, so that should be starting fall 2019. If anyone wants to pursue higher level education in exercise science, and you're a good student and passionate about muscle strength and hypertrophy, let me know. It's in human performance is the focus of the master's. So.
Amazing. And I guess, yeah, if I had any recommendations for the listeners, definitely follow Brad on Facebook. Of all the kind of professionals that I follow over there, Brad is by far the one sharing so much value. The research, his own interpretations, responding to comments is fantastic. And I know you're doing more work on Instagram and everywhere as well. But yeah, Facebook is probably my favorite place to follow Brad. And all of that will be linked in the description box below, so you can go and follow him straight away.
Terrific, Steve.
Awesome. So thank you guys for listening. Thanks again to Brad, and we'll catch you soon.